this last video for chapter 22, we're going to take a good look at the female reproductive hormones and then map that onto the reproductive cycle. So what we think of as both the uterine cycle and the ovarian cycles. Okay, so just like we saw in the male reproductive system, it's gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, that is the trigger that begins puberty and that manages the production of the female reproductive hormones. GnRH is secreted by the hypothalamus, and it stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to release the follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone that the anterior pituitary makes. And we generally see secretion of GnRH beginning somewhere around age 10, and give or take, some girls go into puberty earlier than that. Others, it takes a little longer to reach puberty. But eventually, the production of GnRH and then the FSH and LH production that causes is going to cause menarche, the onset of the menstrual cycle in the female. Follicle-stimulating hormone is released by the anterior pituitary, and now we can see what it's named for. It causes the ovary to mature the follicles that are going to, from which the follicle of the month will be selected, and to mature the oocytes that are found inside those follicles. And LH, luteinizing hormone, when it's released by the anterior pituitary gland, it will stimulate ovarian cells to produce estrogens and progesterones, and it also triggers the rupture and release of the follicle and the release of the oocyte. So it weakens the connections between the cells that form the membrane that covers the little blister-like oocyte follicle that's on the surface of the ovary. And so we see weakening of that membrane, and then the flooding in of fluids that will eventually lead to the increase of hydrostatic pressure that's going to rupture that membrane. And as the membrane ruptures, then the secondary oocyte that is developing within is released into or toward the uterine tubes. So clearly estrogen is a very, very important female hormone, and it is produced in response to the FSH and LH that's being released by the anterior pituitary gland. So when we use that term estrogen, we're actually talking about more than one configuration of the hormone. So there are multiple hormones that we think of as estrogen. They include estradiol. That's probably one of the more powerful of the estrogens that we produce. Estrone, estriol. These are all versions of the very, very similar in chemical structure to each other, and so we lump them all together as the estrogens. And they are secreted primarily by the ovaries, but the adrenal cortex will also produce a small amount of estrogen. So what does it that estrogen does? Well, remember back when we were talking about uterine in development, the development of the fetus in the uterus. The fetus will, if it has the genetics of a female, will produce a lot of estrogen while it is developing, and so the estrogen that's released during early fetal development is what's going to stimulate the formation of the female reproductive organs, what we think of as the primary sexual characteristics. So we're talking about the ovaries, the uterus, the uterine tubes, the vagina, the clitoris, so on. Those are all going to develop based or because of the estrogen that's being released during fetal development. Then at puberty, when we get the second round of the big release of estrogens, we see the growth, development, and maintenance of the ovaries, and as well the increase in size of other organs of the reproductive systems. And we also see the onset of many of the female's secondary sexual characteristics, including the development of breasts and the ducts that will produce milk at the mammary glands. So we see increase in the development of of breast tissue and of the mammary gland ducts. We also see increased deposition of adipose tissue, especially in the breasts, in the thighs, around the thighs, and at the buttocks. So those are the typical places where we see, especially thick production of adipose tissue. And then finally, there's also, as a side effect, some increased vascularization of the skin. We get more blood vessels, more capillaries, especially in the skin as a result of estrogens. And that also relates, that also increases the vascularization of the lining of the uterus. The endometrial lining will have increased vascularization as a result of all this. Now, notice that I did not include in that list body hair, so we're going to get to that in just a second. Progesterone is the secondary, or is the second, not secondary, but the second sex hormone that we think of as one of the primary sexual hormones of the female reproductive system. Progesterone is produced almost exclusively at the ovaries, perhaps other places, but primarily the ovaries. And it is the hormone that is responsible for the changes that we see in the uterine lining, in the endometrium, in preparation for an embryo to come and implant and then get the nutrients and the gases that it requires in order to be able to fully grow and develop. It also will prepare the breast tissue for further stimulation by other hormones. So in the next chapter, when we go to the endocrine system, we're going to talk about prolactin. Prolactin can only have its effect, its strong effects, if the breast tissue has already been primed for that by progesterone. And progesterone is also involved in regulating the secretion of FSH and LH there at the pituitary glands. And then last of all are the androgens. These are the male sex hormones, and females do produce male sex hormones. Just like the adrenal cortex can make estrogen in women and testosterone in men, well, the adrenal cortex also produces testosterone in women. And what we see is sufficient testosterone production to cause the growth of pubic hair and axillary hair, but not enough to cause broad shoulders and the narrow hips that we associate with the female with the male body. So the hips, the shoulders remain somewhat narrowed. The hips grow to become broader as a result of just a small amount of production of testosterone. All right, so the female reproductive cycle involves what is happening both at the ovaries, the ovarian cycle, and what's happening at the uterus, the uterine cycle. So menarche, as we've already said, is the age of first menstrual cycle at puberty, usually around age 11 or 12. So, the GnRH will have been secreting for a while before we see menarche. Menopause, the very last menstrual cycle of a woman's reproductive years, usually occurs midlife, 45 to 55 years old. The average cycle is 28 days, but very few women are, like that kind of regular 28 exactly days. Cycles anywhere from 21 to 35 day long in length are considered normal. And they occur in 3 phases: the proliferative phase, the secretory phase, and then menses. So let's take a look at those stages. So first we're going to look at the proliferative phase. And this occurs early in the cycle. So early in the cycle, we see increased levels of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And they will stimulate on the ovary the development of multiple ovarian follicles. So we'll see several ovarian follicles, maybe as many as 20. being stimulated to come out of dormancy and to pick up where they left off as primary oocytes. And so as the follicular cells become more active, they also begin to secrete estrogen, and so we'll see sort of a general rise in the levels of estrogen found in the body as well. And this is going to cause thickening at the glandular cells of the endometrium, and so we see additional endometrium being put on. The gland cells become are preparing to become active while the follicle is maturing. And then somewhere around day 14 we see a really great increase in luteinizing hormone being released from the anterior pituitary gland. And that's when those fluids flood into the follicle membrane weakens, it stretches, and eventually it bursts, releasing the secondary oocyte. So over the course of the first 14 or so, several weeks of the cycle, the primary oocyte has completed its first round of meiosis, and it is now midway through the second round of meiosis, and so it's a secondary oocyte at ovulation. And it starts heading toward the uterine tube, and the site, the location on the ovary where the follicle burst, and now we have those follicular cells there, they change activity. Now they begin to take on lipid, and so that turns their color slightly yellow, hence the name corpus luteum, and they begin using the lipid that they're taking in as construction material to build estrogen and, most importantly, progesterone. Okay, so now we're ready to think about the secretory phase. So about day 14, the secretory phase begins. So with the corpus luteum producing all that progesterone and estrogens, the uterine glands there at the endometrium really get into business. They enlarge, they start to secrete more nutrients and electrolytes and mucus, all with the intent then of preparing for an embryo that may come and lodge in those tissues and begin to get nutrients from the endometrial lining. Now, if there's no fertilization, then the corpus luteum starts to give up. So somewhere around 10 days after ovulation, so about day 24, the corpus luteum says, hey, apparently we're not going to be growing a baby, and so it stops producing estrogens and progesterones. And as those hormone levels decrease, so we're now kind of right about here in the cycle, as those hormone levels are decreasing, then what we see is that blood vessels in the endometrial lining will constrict, and with the reduced blood flow, then those cells that are at the far, toward the surface of the endometrium are going to begin dying back, and eventually by about day 28 or so, then the endometrium has become so fragile that pieces of it begin to break off, and as it breaks off, that opens up blood vessels, and so there's bleeding and loss of tissue through the cervix down into the vagina, and then from the vagina. And so that is what we think of then as menses, the last component of the reproductive cycle. If, on the other hand, there is an embryo and it begins to grow, it almost immediately begins producing a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin. So chorionic means that's one of the layers in the membrane that completely surrounds the developing embryo. So the chorion is a structure, and that's the location where this hormone is coming from. Gonado, of course, is a reference to the ovaries. Tropin, means it's going to increase the activity of the gonad. So human chorionic gonadotropin is going to then talk to the corpus luteum and say, hey, we got a baby here, you keep up your activity. And in response to HCG then, the corpus luteum will continue to produce progesterone and estrogen, and it will do so until birth or until something happens to the developing fetus. And So as long as the fetus is alive, they're inside the uterus, then it's going to be producing HCG that's going to keep the corpus luteum active and secreting progesterone. And that's what maintains the endometrial lining for the duration of the pregnancy. So, again, back to the no fertilization point of view, then that triggers menses. So as the endometrial lining, begins to slough off and blood from those damaged capillaries is released, then we see menstruation as all that material is being released or lost through the vagina. And this can be accompanied by contractions of the myometrium of the uterus, and that's what we talk about as menstrual cramps. And so the beginning of menstrual flow marks day 1 of the next reproductive cycle. So that's how we know when day 1 is the first blood arriving is indicative of that. So because at the end during menses LH and FSH are so low, then we see GnRH production increase, and then so as LH and FSH production goes lower, then GnRH production will increase, and as a result LH and FSH production will begin to rise again, beginning the development of the next follicle of the month. Alright, so there is kind of a connection between both the ovarian cycle of the production of estrogen and progesterone and its results at the uterus and the uterine cycle. Alright, so last of all thing to talk about then are the mammary glands that are associated as part of the female reproductive system. So the mammary glands are found in breast tissue, and so both males and females have breasts, and but it's only the female, because she's the only one who's producing the estrogens that are then going to cause further development of the breast. Then it's only females who have them developed and enlarged. So their job is to secrete milk that will nourish the newborn infant. Milk is a liquid that's very rich in protein, sugar, and fat. So it's got all the nutrients required for a developing baby to be able to develop well and properly. The ducts from the multiple mammary glands that are found in the breast all come to the surface of the body at the nipple, and there are multiple ducts. You know, my wife and I were shocked to discover that there are so many openings there at the nipple. It's almost more like a shower head than a single water faucet. And so mammary gland development is enhanced by progesterone. So that's why some women experience breast soreness during the menstrual cycle, and see enlargement of the breasts as a part of pregnancy. It's because all those pregnancy hormones, the progesterone especially, are going to have effects at the breast. So there we have it. Everything you ever wanted to know about the hormones of the female reproductive system, plus probably a whole lot more. So I want to encourage you to read on your own about both birth control and sexually transmitted diseases. I'm not going to expect you to know, say, the relative rates of effectiveness of the different birth control methods, but I do want you to pay attention to how, what their mechanism of action is. Are they a barrier? Do they mess with hormones? Do they kill sperm? Do they block sperm? And then I also want you to be aware of some of the different STDs and which of the birth control methods also work as STD control. So there you have it. Good luck studying. You know how to reach me if you have any questions, and do well.